Good evening. Alliance in disarray. Liberals torpedo SDP deal. Nuked. Those are a few of the headlines after the dramatic debate on defence at the Liberal Party Assembly 2 days ago. For tonight's programme, David Steele has come from Eastbourne to join David Owen here in the studio, where they're together for the first time since that moment when the Liberal Assembly, in defiance of both Davids, voted against the Eurobomb and against replacing Polaris. The damage done by that vote is made even worse by today's overwhelming vote against nuclear power by the Liberals, when last week the SDP approved the building of new power stations if and when necessary. At stake is the question of unity. If the Alliance is not united in the run-up to the next general election, then there's little doubt that the prospect of the two Davids achieving their ambition to hold the balance of power will be sharply diminished. As it is, they have a long way to go. This time last year, just after the conferences, the Alliance was riding high in the polls at 35%, more than enough practically to guarantee a hung, or what they would call a balanced parliament. Since then, though, their popularity slumped. They entered the conference season this year at around 24%, a drop of 11 points from that peak of last September. Dr. Owen, what went through your mind when you heard that result on Tuesday?
Well, I suppose a slight sense of shock, and then sympathy for David, and a realisation that we've got to put this behind us and get it clear to the country that we too are quite clear about what needs to be done for the defence of this country. And I believe that that can be done.
Anger at the Liberals?
No, not really anger.
You didn't want to say to them, get your act together?
No. I think I feel... You know, it came as a surprise because everybody did think when I was down there on the Monday that it was all going to go well and it was all right. But politics is like that. You suddenly get these upsets. And it could happen to us, you know. There but the grace of God go I, is one feeling.
Does it not perhaps confirm the doubts that you in the past have sometimes expressed about the likelihood of the Alliance holding together over a long period, simply because on these grave issues there are deep psychological feelings that distinguish the two parties?
Well, it confirms my belief that this is not the time yet to merge our parties and put ourselves into a collective decision-making, but it means that we should negotiate our programme and that there are still some differences of policy which largely stem from history. The origin of this, which is stems from the history of the Liberal Party.
But the nuclear power vote as well confirms, doesn't it, a very significant difference in approach and attitude between the two parties.
I think you can exaggerate that. I think actually the SDP has moved more towards the Liberal position on that. And I think that there's been a long-standing commitment to other forms of energy in the Liberal Party and a very great anxiety. In many ways, they were there first, reflecting anxieties about nuclear safety.
Mr. Steele, in the light of what happened, should you not have intervened personally in that debate and put your own position on the line and try and win those votes around?
That's called being wise after the event, because as David has just said, certainly it was as much a surprise to us as it was to him.
Do you wish you had now?
Well, of course I do, but I mean, that's... you can't rerun a debate. We did not expect to lose. We didn't expect the vote to go that way, but it did.
Do you recognise in the eyes of the electorate now that you look a bit...
There is no such thing as managing the Liberal Assembly. Let's be quite clear about that. It is not that sort of animal. It is a body of free-thinking men and women. You can persuade, but you cannot manage.
Do you acknowledge that, at least in the eyes of the electorate and in political terms, it leaves both of you looking rather silly?
No, I accept that it's embarrassing. But what the country will want to know is that a government which was composed of the Liberal Party and the SDP could be relied on to hold consistent policies of the kind which we'll put forward to them at an election. And there is no division between our two parties in Parliament. The trouble lies between myself and the parliamentary leadership of the Liberal Party and the Assembly. It is not a divide between David Owen and me or between our two political parties.
How long have you got, do you think, to get the Alliance together on this?
Well, for instance, you mentioned a Eurobomb. That's not under discussion. We've never suggested that. We were exploring the idea of a minimum deterrent with a new European emphasis to British defence policy and strengthening the European pillar of NATO. And we were hoping to do this over a period of time, taking both the parties with us. Now that there's been this sort of preemptive strike, I think it will mean we've got to put it, clear the position up And
when you talk
certainly-
about the preemptive strike, you're talking about the Liberals
Yes,
torpedoing the policy. Now,
I don't think they've torpedoed
when you
the
say you've got
policy.
to clear it up, how long do you give it? I mean, you've talked about an election perhaps being in the spring.
Well, we both feel that we've got to get on with this a bit faster in the light of the Assembly's decision. I think we had planned to let this issue ride over the winter mainly because of the talks at Geneva, which is changing the picture the whole time. But I think both of us now feel, in the light of the Assembly result, we've got to speed up our own processes.
By the end of the year?
Well, we're not going to start giving ourselves artificial deadlines, but sooner rather than later. Leave it at that.
And will you this time...
Can I pick up on
Yes,
one
of
thing you
course.
put to David Owen? Because it's not right to suggest that we're poles apart on civil nuclear power, and I think I'd just like to make quite clear on this. Again, the two parties in Parliament and indeed in our policy document are already agreed, and for all practical purposes, we're talking about the next Parliament. Everybody knows that our parties would not order another nuclear power station. Sizewell would be stopped. We've agreed all these things. If you're looking into the dim and distant future as to what our policy might be, well, let's wait till we get there.
Can we pause there just for a second? Because before going on to look further at the details of what they might have to do, we ought to see a little more carefully what's happened. At first, it should be said that on many of the key issues about nuclear weapons, the alliance is united. For example, they agree that battlefield nuclear weapons should be withdrawn from the European front line. They agree that, for the moment, no more American cruise missiles should be deployed in Britain. And on the issue of no first use, they agree that NATO should plan on the basis that nuclear forces will not be used and should not be needed. In the case of Britain's own nuclear weapons, they would also cancel the Trident missile, which the Conservative government has ordered to replace Polaris. But on the issue of Polaris itself, the division has been deep and long-standing. In essence, it's this. The SDP has strongly argued that there should be a replacement for Polaris. The Liberals have long argued the opposite case. Owen, do you still believe that you would get a belly laugh from the electorate if the alliance were not to give a clear answer on the question of Polaris before the election?
Yes, I think if you know enough to cancel Trident, which I think we do, then you know enough at least to say that you want to maintain a minimum deterrent, at least until the atmosphere has totally changed in terms of arms control, and the Soviets and the United States have made very major cuts, in which case you could look again at the question of whether you needed it.
Does that mean that if the voter on the doorstep says to you, and does that mean you want and are prepared to replace Polaris unless those circumstances of general widespread nuclear disarmament occur, you say, yes, we will replace Polaris?
I'd say yes, we would maintain a minimum deterrent.
You can't and wouldn't compromise on that. You wouldn't say we can postpone the decision until after the election.
I don't honestly think you can. I mean, you could, but I don't think that the electorate would give much credence to your decision to cancel Trident. The reason we want to cancel Trident is it's a gross increase in megatonnage and in warhead numbers. It's not a genuine replacement of Polaris, but I think that at the present climate, most people would wish Britain to go on making a contribution. What is our deterrent? It's first and primary a contribution to NATO's deterrent. It's only in the last analysis there as a minimum deterrent if the United States nuclear guarantee, for some reason, is either weakened or withdrawn.
Mr. Steele, you've heard what Dr. Owen said there. You know what your Assembly has said. Do you go along with the view still that it can be postponed, or do you endorse what Dr. Owen says, that you have to be ready to say we will replace?
Well, I took the view back in the summer, and this is where he and I disagreed, that it would be possible to fight the next election on the suggestions outlined by our Joint Commission. But I go further. I also think it's very important that we are both comfortable with the policies that we're proclaiming. It's no good having one of us feeling uncomfortable about it.
But you were very uncomfortable with what he's just said, or not?
No, I'm not. Just wait, let me finish this point.
Sure.
If David is not happy about a particular section of policy, or if I'm not happy about a particular section of policy, then we have got to hammer the thing out, because you cannot go into an election campaign where, in fact, we are proclaiming the advantages of the joint leadership if one of us is actually profoundly unhappy with a basic item of policy.
And is it still your view, is it still your view at the moment that the decision about the replacement of Polaris can be postponed until after the election, as the Commission, the Alliance Commission, proposed?
I would have been happy with that, but I now believe that we can, in fact, make that decision and ought to make that decision now. And I say that because of the explorative talks that we've conducted so far and the further thought that we've given to what the options might be.
Now, we will come to those in a moment.
I just want to clear up. We don't have to decide on the options. We're not going to go into an election brandishing hardware.
Absolutely.
That is the important thing.
We're not in the business of choosing weapons.
Exactly.
But you are prepared, Mr. Steele, sorry, but I just want to get this clear. You are prepared to go into the election with Dr. Owen, yourself saying there must be a replacement of some form or another. We hope it may be a European option.
I'm sorry to correct you. I'm not prepared to use those words because most people interpret replacing Polaris as being what the Tories are proposing, which is the Trident system. That is not acceptable to us because, as David has already said, it is a massive increase in firepower. What I say is that we should be willing and the country should know that a government of which we were part or a government which we formed would maintain the minimum deterrent capacity until such time as arms control negotiations were successful on both sides.
But
now,
I'm sorry to keep pressing this, but it is a key point. Dr. Owen is unambiguous, unequivocal. He wants to go into the election. It's a matter of principle for him. I'm paraphrasing, but I think accurately, to say there will be a replacement given the real world as it stands. You're saying, I'm not prepared to say that. Now, people in the store said again say...
I didn't use the word replacement. If you actually listened, you'd find that we used exactly the same words, to maintain a deterrent. And I think for the same reasons as David, a minimum deterrent, and one which we hope has got a European emphasis because it has at least got, in the last analysis, in the case of the United States not been there, and I hope profoundly that will never happen, there is an understanding between France and Britain about its targeting and about its makeup, which has also been taken out into a much wider understanding with other European countries.
But forgive me, Dr. Owen, don't you in fact believe that there will have to be a replacement of Polaris, whether it takes a Euro or a British or combined form?
Semantics.
It's not semantics, it's rather fundamental.
I think there is not much difference between maintaining a deterrent and replacing Polaris. The only problem about replacing Polaris is you preempt exactly how you're going to do it. You assume it's got to be a submarine. The submarine is, I think, probably the best option. There are a number of different ways you can do it in a submarine, but there is also the theoretical option of ground-launched missiles. There is also the theoretical option of aircraft launch. So you are starting to preempt the options if you use those terms, and that's why I think maintain a deterrent is a more sensible, and clear, and quite categoric position.
And that is all that the other side need to know. You see, we're talking, I mean, President Reagan was talking the other day about starting initiatives for strategic missile agreements between the Soviet Union and the United States. If the Soviet Union thought that we were not willing to maintain our deterrent, they would be very tempted to sit around the negotiating table, protracting the discussions until the Polaris submarine rusted away. If they know that we are prepared to do it, they don't need to know what the system is. In fact, probably better if they don't know what the system is. They must know that our commitment to doing it will be there until we have an arms control agreement.
Now, let me then take it a step further. Dr. Owen, you would be very unhappy if France were the only nuclear weapon state in Europe. You also believe that Europe has to have some nuclear deterrent until there is general nuclear disarmament against the possibility that the Americans might withdraw.
Well, I've always been ready to put Polaris on the negotiating table.
But
and
can I just finish my point? Because I think this is quite important. If I could just finish it, the
you're
point...
not clearly stating what my position is. I think I can correct you on that.
What I'd like to go down this line is that you are saying, when you talk about maintaining a deterrent, that is, you are prepared to do so for a very long time indeed in the real world, which may well mean that you have to maintain a deterrent after Polaris is no longer usable. You're both saying that.
Possible, yes.
Yeah. Do you think it was wise, Mr. Steele, to go so far out on this Euro limb without consulting your party first?
Well, there's a difficulty about that, and I'll be quite straight about it. On the one hand, people say, well, you're not telling us enough about what you're up to. I mean, what are you getting up to in Paris with David Owen? As a sort of general line. The minute then I start to give some indication of the sort of things we're discussing, the complaint then comes, oh, but, you know, we don't want to be committed to that. Well, we're not suggesting that we be committed to any particular system. I make this point again. We're not talking about a particular hardware system, but we have got the responsibility to look at what the options are, and it's a serious responsibility. It's been taken seriously by our European allies, and we've got to go on doing it. But we've only just started.
But isn't it odd and perhaps not very good political management to expect your party to endorse as policy what are in fact simply exploratory steps?
Well, in fairness, we were not asking them to endorse a policy beyond a general proposition that we should look at, you quoted the words a minute ago, look at European cooperation as the basis for a more effective defence policy. It was the Assembly itself, by passing the amendment, saying that that had to be non-nuclear, which preempted the options.
Dr. Owen, if in the end you can't get a European deal, and that's perfectly possible, then given your views about deterrence, you would replace Polaris as a purely independent British nuclear deterrent, albeit reluctantly.
Well, firstly, you will not know what level of cooperation you will get until you're in government, but we do know that the French are ready in principle to talk about coordinating refitting cycles, discussing joint targeting in the event of the US nuclear guarantee not being there, and also are prepared to discuss the possible purchase of hardware. But there are a lot of other options. There are options connected with the US Tomahawk missile, which might be a lot cheaper. One of the reasons, after all, is to get lower costs so you can improve conventional defence forces. The answer to your question is that it really does depend in government as to what happens and what is the professional advice you get. All that I think the electorate are wholly entitled to know is, are you in the business of cancelling Trident in order to give up nuclear weapons completely, or are you in the business of cancelling Trident because it's far too costly, maintaining a deterrent and hoping to contribute to a massive reduction in nuclear weapons all round, and eventually the United States and the Soviet Union and everybody taking out nuclear weapons? After all, China is also a nuclear power as well as France and Britain.
Given the realities of worldwide possession of nuclear weapons as they are at the moment, isn't it, to use your terms, fudging and mudging not to acknowledge that what you are talking about is replacing Polaris in one form or another?
Well, I think what David and I have already said is that we realise that it may well be that that minimum deterrent would have to be in place when some of the Polaris boats are phased out because they're old and rusty. You know, the Soviet foreign minister said to us both, we're not asking you not to modernise your deterrent. All we're asking is you don't give it an 8-fold increase in warhead numbers, which you're doing with Trident.
Mr. Steele, are you going to carry on along Dr. Owen's line as if Tuesday hadn't happened?
No, I mean, I'm not going to answer questions of that kind because I've got to speak to my own party, and I think they should know first what I propose to do rather than yourself, if you forgive me. But I wanted to follow what David Owen was just saying, because
Can I just press? I'll let you follow. I'll let you follow what you're saying, but I just want to pick up on this one point.
This issue of you said arms control doesn't happen, you say, and therefore we're going to be stuck with this for a long time. Now, what I believe is that the multilateral case, and I've always been a multilateral disarmer, has, I must admit, been weakened by the fact that there's not much to show for arms control talks. And one of the reasons why we have wanted to take this issue slowly through this winter is that it does appear, we can't be confident about it, but it does appear that for the first time we're about to get a major breakthrough in arms reduction. That will change the climate of public opinion in this country. It will change the balance of argument between unilateralism and multilateralism, and is a very important consideration, and that's why we didn't want to be too cut and dried at this stage about defence policy.
Mr. Steele, do you intend to abide by that resolution? Will you report back for their decision?
I think you're completely distorting what the Assembly said and what we have said, because I think that resolution ran to 36 lines, 35 and a half of which were almost word for word in the circular that David Owen and I sent some months ago to all our candidates on this very subject.
There's a key phrase there, which I must... I've got to interrupt you. I'm sorry, no, you would have to... I must ask you this time to let me...
The key phrase in that circular is that the final decision will be taken by the elected MPs. We are not, never have been going to take the final decision alone. And therefore, what we said in our circular some time before this resolution is wholly in accord with the resolution.
But that means that the MPs will decide and you will go back to them.
Of course.
Now, what else do you think we do?
They will decide whether or not you can go into any alliance. Now, if that's the case, and if Mr. Steele is bound by that, and if you do well, they're going to have a much heavier say in what kind of alliance you form than the SDP MPs likely to have, largely because they're going to almost certainly have many more MPs. Now, on this defence question, doesn't that mean that the prospect of alliance with the Conservatives is made much more remote, despite all these rumours, Mr. Steele, of you talking with Conservatives?
Well, you forget the rumours. I mean, that's a real silly season conference story. There are enough stories flying around the conference without those being made up. On the issue itself, you misunderstand the nature of the alliance in Parliament. We are two parties, we have our own leaders, we have our own whips, but we meet regularly to discuss the issues of parliamentary business. I cannot recall a single occasion, I don't know if you can, David, when we've ever met and had a division with Liberal MPs and one arguing one case and SDP MPs another. I cannot recall it.
We don't vote, but frequently you can see a pattern which is across the party. There's a consensus that's formed. And I agree with David. The fact is we'll have fought an election together on a common programme for government. We will negotiate together and we will form a government together.
Is the issue of proportional representation a prerequisite for a pact, as your Chief Whip said?
We've always said, there's nothing new in this, we've always said that the two prerequisites of forming any government with anybody else would be progress on electoral reform and the attack on unemployment. There are other things we would like to have as well.
Progress on electoral reform is different from proportional representation, isn't it?
It's the same thing.
It's the same thing. So you're agreed on that as well?
Yes.
You also agreed that you can't talk to the Conservatives while Mrs Thatcher's there, even if she happened to go. In principle, if she's there, you wouldn't talk to the Conservatives, Dr Owen?
Well, we've always really believed that this is an issue, a constitutional issue, which we won't face. We won't be forced into a situation which I think has got some problems to it, telling other parties what their leaders are going to be. She's simply not going to want to sit in a coalition government, having imperiously ruled for the last 8 years. It's that we've had 8 years then. She will go to Dulwich voluntarily, there's no doubt about that. She'll have, after all, lost the election, so I don't think you need worry. This is not a major issue.
The idea that we should be sitting around Downing Street waiting for us to come for tea is really faintly preposterous.
She may stay as a caretaker Prime Minister for a few days, so as the Queen government go on, while a new leader emerges in the Conservative Party and negotiations take place. That would actually be the right constitutional position.
Before we get into these wonderful scenarios of you sitting down and doing these balanced Parliament negotiations, it must cross your mind today, however reluctantly, that large numbers of the electorate might well be saying that what's emerged this week is that whereas Dr Owen controls his party, Mr Steele doesn't control his, and therefore politically you're not a credible duo for government. Very briefly.
Well, first of all, I don't blame people for saying that as far as the conference is concerned, but then I've never pretended to control the Liberal Assembly. What they do know is that our parliamentary parties are united.
In one word, Dr Owen.
Exactly. It's a different constitution. It's a consultative assembly, the Liberals. Ours is a totally democratically elected assembly. I believe that David's power to finally decide the manifesto is recognised, very important. And what is important to the people of this country is that we two are united.
We'll see what happens and whether you manage to achieve that. Gentlemen, thank you very much.